Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back after what in the Chancery Division of the High Court will be termed the short adjournment. And we're now going to deal with the question of the future of legal education. We've got an hour and a half and a number of very distinguished panelists. I'm going to say that my role is going to be just to keep people to time and to make the odd intervention now and again. One of the great benefits of being an emeritus professor is that one doesn't teach, one lectures, and so one can really just say what one wants. So without more ado, it's a great pleasure to welcome Daniela Nagy from the British Institute and also from the Reconnect research program, and she's going to kick off. So, Daniela, without more ado, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, so my name is Daniela Nagy. I'm a research fellow here in the rule of law at BICL. And today I'm going to be talking about the project that I've been working on for the past 8 months. It's a series of educational materials which is designed to enable young people and educators to engage with discussions about what the EU is and the rights of EU citizens, about the meaning and importance of concepts such as what is democracy, the rule of law, human rights. So thematic issues that we hope will engage younger audiences, but also maybe older audiences. But these are a series of educational materials designed primarily to engage young people with these topics. And I have a PowerPoint presentation that I would like to pull up, please, if that's possible. And I'm going to guide you through. So yeah, this is of course as part of the Reconnect project. So these are educational materials for young people living in the EU that together with my colleagues, Lucy Moxham and Julinda Belkira, I have been working on. So it's the three of us from the BICL Institute who have worked on this and in cooperation with the University of Leuven. If we could pull to the next slide, please. Okay, so our strategy envisages that Reconnect will target younger generations of Europeans and young people living in the EU through the production of EU educational materials. And I've got a hard copy here, and it's nice to see it in real life, to have a physical copy of it as well. We will produce 10 info sheets altogether. These are 5 here in the pile I have in front of me, but it's 10 in total for different age groups. Our first age group is 9 to 11-year-olds, and the second age group is 12 to 16-year-olds. So as you can imagine, the language used is slightly different for these 2 age groups, so we had to make it age specific, but the core ideas are the same. And the focus is, as I said before, on EU rights, democracy, and the rule of law, also human rights, and also what is my right as an EU citizen. And it's really a short combination of texts and graphics. And we were very lucky to be able to work with a very good graphic designer, Dan Gold, who I'll mention later on again on these graphics, just to kind of illustrate these concepts in visual form. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we look at the info sheets for 9 to 11-year-olds, it consists of short fact sheets. There's a focus on explaining key concepts in simple language, and it's more heavily graphics based. So if you look at the info sheets in front of you, you'll see that the graphics for the slightly younger age group are slightly bigger. So there's, so that these younger kids can essentially really visualize also what these concepts are. And the language, of course, is age appropriate. So we had to, it was quite a challenge actually, because you had to really distill it and make it as accessible and simple and age appropriate as possible. Now, for the older age group, the 12 to 16-year-olds, we also have short fact sheets, but the resources for the older children will explore more complex ideas. So there we go into more detail, and we try to use slightly more complex sentences as well. And then we also have guidance for educators. These are short guidance notes for educators, which accompany each topic. And there's links to further online resources and discussion questions. And I should also emphasize that we have videos that accompany these sheets. So videos which then again provide another insight into what we're discussing. Next slide, please. And so here you see the core concepts. So the first 5 you have in front of you are as follows. Number 1, what is the EU? So there we go into detail about what the European Union is, why it exists, how it was established, what it's designed to do. Then in the second one, we look at what are my rights as an EU citizen? So what can I as an EU citizen do? What does it allow me to do? Are there also any obligations involved? Then thirdly, what are human rights? So this is, of course, very interesting, I think, to explain to young people, what are human rights really? What do they consist of? What do they mean? Fourth, what is the rule of law? Which again is not an easy concept to explain always. So it was quite a challenge to actually try to produce it and explain it to a younger audience. So I hope that that's very useful as well. And then number 5, what is democracy? And we go all the way back to some of the ancient philosophers to explain what democracy is to a younger audience. And then the next 5 topics, which we haven't printed off yet, but are being edited at the moment, are what are my rights as a child? So there we go into detail about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, for example. What is the EU doing about migration, which of course is very topical, and it was very interesting to be able to explain to young people what the current crises consists of and what the current challenges for Europe are when it comes to migration issues. Number 8, what is the EU doing about climate change? Again, very topical, because the EU, of course, takes, I think, a key role in the fight against climate change worldwide. So it was very interesting to write this about climate change and global warming. Number 9, what is the EU doing to make the internet and social media safer for me? So again, this is very important in the era of digitalization and of course the increase in social media that young people have to contend with. And number 10, how does the EU support my education and training? And there we also talk about things like Erasmus Plus and teacher training programs and exchanges. So these are the 10 info sheets that we will produce. We have produced 5 already, and the next 5 are currently in production. Okay, next slide, please. And here you have an overview of some of the work we have already produced. So the first info sheet for young people is about what is the EU. So, and I've given you an example of the info sheet for 9 to 12-year-olds. So here we discuss, again, first of all, an overview of what is the EU actually, what kind of alliance or organization is it, with an explanation that it consists of 27 European countries, and why they came together, what are the EU symbols. So the flag, for example, is a very important EU symbol. So we have a box here which explains the EU symbols, and then quick facts about the EU as well. How many people live in the EU? So that's, I think, very important as well. What is the biggest country in the EU, for example, just to give a sense to young people about the dimensions we're dealing with. And then you see on the right-hand side, we have an overview of the different institutions of the EU, because we felt it was very important to explain to young people what these different institutions are and also what they do. So we have the Court of Justice of the EU, for example, the European Commission, the Council of the EU, the European Parliament, and the Central Bank in Frankfurt. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then, so just a bit of a closer overview of, so again, here, what is the EU, an outline of how we explain it, the different boxes, and you can also see links to videos, which then have an additional or provide additional information to what we discuss. Next slide. And here we see on the second, so this would be the second page of the first info sheet. How was the EU created? What are the EU's values as well? We felt was very important to explain. So the rule of law, human dignity, freedom, human rights, democracy, all these foundational values which are so central to the European Union. Next slide, please. And again, you see the graphics, of course, I shouldn't forget to mention that, provided by our graphic designer, Dan Gould, who we cooperated with very extensively. So you see here, for example, what is the value, what is the currency of the EU, right? And you have some banknotes, and what is the EU single market? We also felt was very important to explain. So how does the single, what is the single market? Why is it so central to the EU? And how does it work? What does it mean to you and I? Okay, next slide, please. And then again, an overview of the institutions here with an explanation next to it about what each institution does and what its functions are, and also how they differ from each other. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the second topic, second info sheet is what are my rights as an EU citizen? And here again, you see an explanation of what is EU citizenship and the fact that it's an additional citizenship to your original citizenship. So you have on your passport the EU symbol as well. What do you get from the EU? So what privileges, if you will, do you get by being an EU citizen? What does it enable you to do? And so this is the first page of the second info sheet. Again, you see the graphics there. And then we have topic 3 on the right-hand side. What are human rights? So where do human rights come from? Why do they exist? Where do they originate from? And then the quick facts sheet or box, I should say, with a bit of history about the United Nations and so modern contemporary human rights, and the fact that the United Nations really is an organization that is designed to promote freedom, security, peace, and also human rights at the same time. The next slide, please. And then this is the fourth topic is what is the rule of law? So again, this would be the first page of topic 4. And here we have an illustration of the key principles, values that underpin the rule of law. So the fact that everybody is equal before the law, the fact that there are clear and simple rules, transparent rules that everybody should follow, access to justice as well, to the courts, so that everybody should have access to justice, the use of power as well, that should be fair. And of course, human rights as well, right, would be another dimension, a substantive view of the rule of law, so that it should also protect human rights and human dignity. And then on the right-hand side, you see number 5. The 5th topic is what is democracy, and the first page of that. And again, we go back to some of the ancient Greeks to explain what democracy, where does it come from? So etymologically speaking, so demos, people, kratos, ruler, power, and then how it differs from dictatorships, for example. So really trying to explain that to young people. And again, the box with quick facts. So again, this idea that it derives from the ancient Greeks, but that it has successfully been instituted in many countries around the world. Okay, next slide, please. So what is our strategy for disseminating this information? We have a dedicated strategy for disseminating these educational materials. We're going to put it on our website, of course, so where it's accessible to everybody who's interested. We're going to use social media very extensively to distribute our materials, and hopefully, I think we will do this next week. There will be an extensive social media campaign. There will be a launch event probably in early March, where we're going to physically present all the material, and I'm hoping that many people will attend that. And an email distribution. So we have a distribution list as well of educational organizations around Europe. And we're hoping to share this far and wide, and also hoping to reach schools in Europe with this. Okay, and the next slide, please. And how will we gauge the success of these educational materials? By the number of downloads from the website, the number of impressions on social media. So again, we're hoping that we will get a good reception and also that people will talk about it. The number of click-throughs through the Reconnect website from social channels, the quality of comments and feedback as well, of course, including tagging friends, and the number of educators and organizations receiving the information via email. So again, hoping to reach as many organizations as possible. And we've located quite a lot in many different countries across Europe. Okay, and the next slide, please. That's it, yes. So I would like to thank you for attending today, and for those of you who are not here, for listening. And I'm looking forward to hopefully quite a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Ladies and gentlemen, with your agreement, I think I'm going to take questions at the end of the group so we can let everyone else speak. Our next speaker is Maaike de Ridder. Maaike, welcome virtually from Leuven. And she is, as I've just said, at the University of Leuven and also involved in the Reconnect program. So Maaike, welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be on this panel. I am here today to present the Reconnect MOOC. I made a short presentation, so I'm going to try to share my screen. Am I sharing now?
Yes.
Okay, so wait, let me. Okay. I can't seem to see the presentation myself. So if I do this, do I go to the next slide? Yes, okay. So the Reconnect MOOC is a massive open online course on rule of law and democracy in Europe. It is, much like the info sheets, one of the educational materials that was developed under the Reconnect project, and it is run on the edX platform. The main goal of the MOOC was really to educate citizens and engage with citizens on various topics, such as their general understanding of the EU, the concepts of democracy and the rule of law, the EU institutions and their roles and their tools in the democracy and rule of law crisis, and also the main challenges faced by democracy and rule of law in some key EU policy areas, such as trade, migration, and now also COVID-19. The target audience of the MOOC were EU and non-EU citizens of all ages and all educational backgrounds. And I will come back to this in a couple of slides to show you whether we have reached this audience. The MOOC consists of 6 modules and a final exam, and each module is composed of various lecture videos, exercises, discussion sessions, and also testimonials. And these videos feature various experts of the Reconnect Consortium, such as Professor Wouters, Professor Grogan, and many, many others. And the main focus of the MOOC was really to interact with citizens, have them interact with each other, and have them interact with EU topics. And you can see on the slide that I provided a small example from one of the discussion assignments. So throughout all the modules, learners are confronted with reflection questions on which they have to formulate their own opinion, and then they get to discuss their opinion with other learners. And we also get to see this discussion for us, so they also get to interact with us, as well as with the general course material. The Reconnect MOOC has had 2 successful runs so far. It is currently on its 3rd run. The first run of the MOOC was launched in November of 2020. This was the only instructor-based run that we organized, meaning that one module would go live each week, and learners had to follow the MOOC at this fixed pace. But the 2nd and the 3rd run are self-paced MOOCs, meaning that learners have a time frame of a couple of months to follow the MOOC at their own pace and in their own time. And when they have completed all of the course materials, so when they have watched all the videos, completed all the exercises, and passed the final exam, they can also receive an official MOOC certificate.
Hi, Maaike. Sorry to interrupt. Just to let you know, your slides aren't moving, so we just see the front slide.
Oh, okay. Wait, let me check. Maybe.
I would suggest going to presenter mode, so start from the start of the slides, and then you should be able to go through them.
Yeah, I can't really see my own slides on the Zoom application. I don't know what is causing this.
If you go to the bottom right-hand corner of the screen next to the slider, it's the first button left of the slider, and that should go full screen for you.
Wait. Is it moving now?
No, if you go to the, if you want to just click through it, then that's fine. It just wasn't moving before.
And now it is.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so you didn't see any of the slides? Okay, what would you like me to do? Should I quickly just show you the slides? Was the explanation clear?
Yes, very quickly. Bear in mind, we've got about 17 minutes in total. So
Yeah, okay. So here you can see just all that I went through, the main goals, the target audience, the reflection question, and here the information on the runs. And I think I ended here at the MOOC certificate, right? Yeah. Okay. And then we're getting to the Reconnect MOOC in numbers. So the total enrollment of all the runs combined is now at 3,554 learners. This number is still going up every day, so this is not a fixed number. And these learners have represented in total 99 countries and regions worldwide, which is really good news because that means that our MOOC is reaching far beyond the borders of the EU. You can also see that the top 5 countries of registration are slightly different for each run. So in the first run, we have reached mostly people from Belgium, then the UK, Turkey, the US, and the Netherlands. In the second run, Poland was the front runner, followed by Belgium, the UK, the US, and Italy. And in the third run, it was again Belgium, UK, Turkey, the US, and Italy. In terms of gender, most of our learner base is female, and 38% is male, and 1.2% of our learners identified as other. And the median learner age is 26. So the MOOC has mainly reached young citizens of the age group of 25 and under, but we have also reached quite a lot of people from the age groups of 26 to 40 years of age, and 17.4% was over 41. Now to end, how can the MOOC be used for educational purposes? So the MOOC is a standalone course. It's an introductory course. It's interdisciplinary, so it can be followed by anyone, anywhere, just by itself. But it can also be integrated in a university course for courses such as European Studies or EU Law, where it can be very flexible. So you can either replace some of the regular lectures with MOOC modules, or you can use it as supplemental material for students in your course. So it's really flexible to integrate it in any type of course. And it can also serve as an entry requirement for courses. We did this for the SDG MOOC, which is another MOOC that was created by the KU Leuven, where students now have to follow the MOOC in order to enter a certain course. And then the MOOC can also be used to collect input from learners to feed into research. And that is what we're currently doing for Reconnect. So we're really monitoring the input that we get from all the learners on various EU topics and trying to see where we can feed this into the Reconnect deliverables, where this might be of added value. And that was all on the MOOC, so thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Maaike. That's very nice and very much to time. On the same basis, Maaike, if you'd please stay with us, we will take questions right at the end of the speakers, the sessions. And it's a great pleasure that I give the floor now to Professor Armin Kuivers, who is from the University of Leiden. Welcome, Armin. Is there a wave? Welcome, Armin. Armin, the floor is yours. So tell us from the view from Leiden.
Thanks very much indeed. Unfortunately, I couldn't be here today in person. I had planned, I had booked, and then Omicron was the final straw that actually drove my university to prohibit me from traveling to such a dangerous place as the UK. So I'm doing this online. Also, I'm trying to mimic the High Representative by multi-hatting. So I'm sitting here today both as a professor of European law and as the master director of the Leiden Law School, and also as the director of Compare, where we do exchange programs with other regional organizations. So that gives me a couple of perspectives, and I might add a fourth, which is the father of two young children who are almost old enough to look at some of the sheets presented earlier. So I'll try to integrate those different views. Now, the question was whether I wanted to reflect on teaching youth and European integration, both in my experiences here in Leiden and from the faculty perspective. And I thought I would be slightly provocative here. Now, one problem we have when we debate our teaching philosophy here in Leiden, is that on the one hand, it's easy to say that our job has not changed much since Socrates, which is that we need to teach people to think critically, and that's it. And that challenge has never really differed. We have different materials and different tools, but the core is the same. And to a certain extent, I would say that's correct, right? Essentially, we aim to create critically thinking, independent-minded, societally engaged young people at university. On the other hand, the world has changed quite a lot. And I do think that we need to take that into account when we look at our responsibilities and our tools. Now, a couple of claims that may be food for discussion later on, so I'm going to be maybe sharper than I would normally be in my own views. The first is that we might have to rebalance basically the relative weight of knowledge, and especially in law, legal knowledge and expertise we transfer to just more broadly skills, critical skills, didactics, interacting. How do you collaborate? How do you critically deal with empirical data? How do you critically deal with modern technologies? How do you deal with interdisciplinary dialogue? And that we spend more time on that and less on the specific case law or texts of EU legislation that might change in 5 years anyway. Now, that's, as I said, just a challenge out there. The second claim would be that we may have to spend more time on normative issues, and that we may have actually become slightly lazy here as universities, assuming that everyone who reaches a certain level of intellectual evolution becomes a liberal and supports EU values, supports Western values, supports liberal values. And that actually, like good liberals, you do not want to use schools to impose liberal values because it's anti-liberal to impose your values. Now, that system has worked for a while, but increasingly we see that there is actually significant pushback. Now, intellectual pushback is only to be welcomed, but this pushback is increasingly taken different forms, and forms that do not adhere to academic debate or rules and use different tools and techniques. So when I get students now, a lot of their information comes from social media, comes from other sources, and not all of that information is accurate, to say it mildly. Yet, if I use my traditional tools and techniques, I might not be able to counter them, nor might I be able to get to them at an early enough phase. So in that sense, I strongly applaud the attempt to reach people already from age 9 onwards. But I also wonder whether we should become more active and engaging in our teaching, engage the broader public, meaning that we also should train ourselves more in techniques to do that. Should I do a 10-second TikTok movie on the rule of law? Currently, I'm not equipped to do that. I don't think it would be a major hit if I do it. But it's a platform that has significantly more viewers than my average podcast on EU law. Now, that means that we may also have to become more engaged and simply take a normative stance. At the same time, that's also very dangerous, because if you start doing that, you become political actor as a university. And that means that you open yourself up for attack, and you should also be opened up for attack because you take a normative stance. But it's increasingly a dilemma I'm facing here, whether you see yourself as a player, a bastion of defending certain values or not, or as a neutral liberal teacher, and you leave the societal debate, you only aim to inform students. But to be more provocative, let's just say that we should become more active there, unless later they say we were just rearranging deck chairs on our own liberal Titanic, as we were heading into a major iceberg. And then maybe as a last point, it may also require that we interact more with other disciplines, and that we inherently teach our students to be more interdisciplinary. For example, if we take the example of these teaching materials, right? I would be curious to hear if you also discussed with educational experts and psychologists to ask, how do you reach a certain age group? What type of narrative, what type of values, what type of comments, what type of form land? Because we tend to start from our own expertise and what we consider objective truths, instead of where is the knowledge supposed to land. And there I wonder whether we could actually do much more to work with people who are experts, for example, marketeers who can actually sell you something that is very bad for you yet you still want it. So how can we sell stuff that is actually quite good to people in a way that's more convincing? So this is more basically my wish list or critical thinking, or what keeps me up at night as a teaching director and a lecturer. And I thought I'd abuse this panel to get some insights from other people on these thoughts. So thanks very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Armin. Perhaps I can just abuse my privilege as chairman and to put my hat on as a past president of the European Law Faculties Association. I was president 2015 to 16. We are quite busy with the Alpha Law Journal, which looks at legal education and is available on the internet. And it strikes me that actually the elephant in the room here is that we haven't got Nigel Duncan, who is professor of legal education at City University, effectively the old Inns of Court School of Law, the professional end at City, who I think would have some very interesting things to say, and I think could possibly make a very valuable input to the Reconnect discussion and debate. So with that, having flagged that up, let me give the floor to Paul Blocker from the University of Bologna, our great mother of house of university study in Europe, and also a participant in Reconnect. So Paul, with great pleasure, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me in this great event. And I have to admit, the preceding speaker put so many interesting things on the table that I find it now difficult to present my little contribution, but I will do my best. Indeed, in the Reconnect project, I'm coordinating the work package that is supposed to do something that is actually impossible, and that is produce a new narrative for Europe, for the European integration project. And so I was asked for today to speak a little bit about that construction of a narrative in the light of how it would speak to younger people, which is, I think, an extremely important question that we are struggling with, together with the larger struggle of how do you actually create a narrative that is not simply a top-down sort of bureaucratic utopian vision of the European Union, but that actually speaks to people, that engages people, that makes them think in certain directions. And so in that sense also, I think it ties in with what has been said before. And it seems to me that there are three issues that we particularly need to look at. Our narrative will perhaps not be fully comprehensive because it comes forth out of the main research foci of the Reconnect project, which is in particular democracy, the democratic deficit of the European Union on the one hand, and the rule of law and the rule of law crisis on the other. So that is sort of the context in which we try to create a narrative, a new narrative, a narrative that seeks to speak to a wider audience. And one of the key messages there will be that we see democracy and the rule of law as heavily interrelated, not simply, as I feel it is sometimes perceived as the rule of law as simply a precondition for democracy, but actually a vital democracy and a vital constitutional democratic system as based on an ongoing interaction and dynamic interaction between the rule of law and democracy. And from that perspective, I think it is of great importance that our narrative speaks to young people. To give you one example, and indeed I should stress that I'm a sociologist and a social legal scholar, so I look at law in a slightly different way than lawyers tend to do. And for me, one of the recent reports of the European Fundamental Rights Agency is of great value in that regard. A survey on what fundamental rights mean to people in Europe, and they surveyed something like 35,000 people. And one of the striking things that comes out of that survey is that particularly amongst young people, there's quite some, as they put it, nonchalance, some attachment of little importance to some of the key dimensions of classical democracy, of electoral democracy, and also with regard to human rights, rights of minorities, etc. So in a way, echoing what has been said before, we have a great challenge there. That is, if rights, if fundamental rights, as in the European Union's parlance of human rights more broadly speaking, are not perceived as important for young people, we have an enormous problem there. And so there, one of the things we will try to do is to try to translate abstract notions of the rule of law and human rights into a language that actually, in one way or the other, has some meaning within the ordinary life worlds of young people. And I'm saying this now in lofty terms, perhaps, but this is actually dramatically difficult, I think. It's not merely, in my view, about stating what human rights are or where they come from. I think as a social legal scholar, I believe it's extremely important to think about these matters as not just about law in the books, etc., but as part of a legal culture, of rule of law cultures, or as the literature would call it, as a consciousness with regard to the law. And that, I don't think you do that by just throwing articles of the European Convention to people. We need to do something more there. We need to explain, as one scholar in the Netherlands called it, that rights, human rights, are not simply rights for others. As for instance, in Dutch foreign policy, the rights for others in all those places where there are dictatorships, etc. But rights are also relevant, or perhaps even more relevant, for people on the ground, for citizens and young people within our own societies. And that's a huge challenge, I think. So that's a first thing I think our narrative should be addressing, this unawareness, in a way, of the significance of the legacy of human rights in the larger democratic context. And related to that then, and there has already been said a lot about this, is that our narrative in one way or the other needs to tap into indeed a dimension of what is now, again, we're quite a fashionable term, it seems to me, and that is civic education. A broad form of education, which is indeed, in a way, a kind of preparation for citizenship, not merely in a formal sense, I would say, but in an active sense, in a critical sense. And it's striking that if you follow the ongoing conference on the future of Europe, where there are quite some citizens, some 800 citizens sort of randomly selected, are part of citizens panels. And in one of those panels, which is exactly on democracy and the rule of law, one thing that keeps on coming up is a call for such civic education, particularly in the context of the EU. And if I might say, between parentheses, a bit of a critical remark on the sheets for the very young people that have been developed within Reconnect, I wonder why there is such an attention for the UN and less so for the European Convention, for the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which in some ways are much more tangible in the everyday situation of European citizens. So, as I said, the issue with the lack of awareness regarding human rights is important for young people. The issue of civic education, I think, and for instance, in the place I live in Italy, there's now again a big debate about how that should be strengthened, civic education within schools. And of course, it's very difficult to measure the tangible results of that type of education, but I think it's extremely important. And thirdly, and this relates to both other points, I think we should, in our narrative, try to stimulate forms of bottom-up engagement and participation. And again, there, I think it's not merely that we want our young people in Europe to be able sum up what Article 8 in the European Convention says, but rather I think it would be important that they would be able to critically think about the actual objectives of convention rights, etc. And so one aspect that I would like to also a little bit provocatively like to promote is that I think it's extremely important to, in a way, educate and stimulate young people, not only to think about human rights as important, but how to actually actualize, implement, promote human rights by means of protest, by means of lobbying, by means of litigation. That doesn't necessarily go from the 9 to 14 age group or so, but from 20 years onwards, I think that would make a lot of sense. And I'm also saying this because this week I was finalizing a course on social legal issues at the University of Bologna. And one of our students, she gave a presentation on her human rights activism in Moscow, in Russia, leading a student journal that is being repressed by the authorities. And that whole presentation also made me think how important it is, not simply to stand up for rights, but actually to make them work in our everyday realities. And well, as you can see, there's a big challenge here in our attempt to formulate a narrative that, at least in some ways, tries to speak to these very significant challenges. So I would stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've got some very interesting food for thought there on this 60th anniversary of the London-Leiden meetings. And the floor is open. I don't know if anyone is busting a gut. Can I see anyone who wants to raise a hand? Possibly. Sorry, yes, Michael. Michael's on site here, so he's
thank you very much.
There.
And thank you for excellent presentations. This is really, really meaningful and important work. And I just wanted to give a few reflections on each of the presentations. And I think, okay.
At least people can see you on the.
Hello, everyone on Zoom. I'm back. Hey. So good to be back. I think from my standpoint as a member of the UK Solicitor General's panel on public legal education and someone who is very interested in how we get knowledge from the ivory tower out into society, the things that these Reconnect work packages are doing are absolutely, in my humble opinion, the most important work packages across the programme, because it's all well and good legal academics who teach and research around issues, speaking amongst themselves about these things. But if it doesn't get out of the university front door, we don't create conditions in society that can sustain justice institutions when they come under attack. We operate in a situation where people don't know about the possibility of bringing legal challenges, and most significantly, we deplete their ability to be active citizens in using the law to reform and change the world around them. And having been in charge of putting together a MOOC and putting together educational materials around law for quite a while, and thinking about whether it's knowledge, skills, or confidence that we should be promoting in legal education, I've been a fellow traveller, and many of the things that have been discussed in this area. And I wanted to start those reflections. So in terms of massive open online courses, our Citizenship and the Rule of Law MOOC has promoted and encouraged people to sign up to the Reconnect MOOC. And many of our learners who join that think that they're getting a really holistic impression of, in the first MOOC, what the rule of law might mean generally, and in the specific Reconnect MOOC, how it applies specifically within the European Union. And this is something that I only became aware of when I was doing my own research for the first of those two MOOCs. The two MOOCs that I just described are actually the first and only rule of law MOOCs this is not a topic which has been widely discussed in the educational space online. There aren't many YouTube videos about what the rule of law might mean, with some very small content producers being some of the only videos that are available. And I think we need even more initiatives like the 2 MOOCs that Reconnect and the Bingham Centre have created over the last 2 years in order to showcase and encourage people to understand and use some of this stuff. I don't know about the Reconnect statistics, but in our breakdown from Coursera of who's doing our rule of law MOOC, we found that it was in proportion with Coursera's usual learner, somebody who is younger, somebody who is more female, somebody who's drawn more from the global south, with over 192 different jurisdictions being represented. So I absolutely think that there is a big opportunity to seize 21st century tools for us to get out and disseminate all of the knowledge that we have to the people that need it. And that's why I think the Reconnect MOOC is a really big initiative, and I'll keep plugging it with people who come through our doors as well. In terms of these fact sheets that Daniela and co have gone at great pains to put together, I think that this is another space where there's quite a pressing social problem which is being partially resolved by this. Amnesty International did a survey of teachers where they found that about 45% of teachers do not feel confident having conversations about human rights in the classroom. And UCL's Institute of Education next door found that law and human rights instruments are one of the areas where there's the biggest blind spot amongst the citizenship teacher inductee community, people who are going to become citizenship teachers. And there's a real shortage of specialist knowledge and advice in this area, which is why that first page, Guidance Notes for Educators, is doing a great job in helping to buttress some of the areas in which teachers don't feel confident to have these critical conversations, introducing young people to these concepts of democracy and the rule of law. And in terms of a final sort of reflection, the comments that were raised around what do we balance in what we are teaching? Are we teaching people about instruments and moments in order for them to have knowledge to say, well, my dictator shouldn't be doing this? Or are we trying to teach them behaviors that then say, well, I don't know why the dictator shouldn't be doing that, but something about it feels wrong, so I'm going to work with others to try and change it? Or are we developing skills, which is those notions of criticality and debate, which enable us to be able, when presented with the diktat from the kleptocrat, to be able to get people together to challenge it? So it's a mix of all of those things that I see represented in the materials and the work packages here. They give me real confidence that we're making a big contribution. And the one thing I'd say is, let's keep disseminating and keep talking and keep engaging on these issues past the end of the life of the program, because that's the more long-term sustainable way that we're going to make a real difference on these issues. That was an unscripted intervention. Sorry for taking too much of the time, but you really provoked a lot of thought in me, and thank you very much.
I think that's very much a worthwhile intervention. I'm glad you made it. It's also important for us to realise, there's this, at the moment in the United Kingdom, that here too the rule of law is under threat. Now, at the moment, the government ministers start talking about leaving the European Convention of Human Rights because they don't happen to find judgments convenient. You're absolutely in the same situation that you are with other countries in the EU and outside, where the moment politicians start talking about finding judicial pronouncements inconvenient and therefore needing to do something about it, you know which way one is going, and that is some form or other of a dictatorship. And at the moment the administration says we find it inconvenient and therefore we're going to abolish things, that's the time to watch out, and indeed it shouldn't be allowed to come to that. So it's important that I think that you make these points, and it's also important you make the point that the documentation and the progress and the instruments which have been made available through Reconnect and the other rule of law projects will actually continue to be available as permanent value. And that's actually one of the interesting criteria for selection under Horizon 2020 and its successor programs is, are things going to continue? Are the benefits going to continue? Or are they going to be merely transient? So thank you for that intervention, which I think was very useful. I think we'll go for ladies first, Alison, and then Armin, if I may. Alison, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Alison MacDonald from the University of Leiden, and I run the Common Market Law Review. Although I have a lot to answer to Armin, or not to answer, more questions to put to Armin, because we are colleagues and I could, in theory, do that much more often. I would rather prefer to take a moment now, after having thanked very much all the presentations so far, the people who did presentations so far, and also a fascinating intervention by Michael. But my question, to try and be brief to Paul, is this: you're talking about rights, and I wonder whether you make a differentiation in that between individual rights and social rights. I could explain that more at length, but you're no doubt aware yourself that there are some critical voices that an overemphasis on individual rights can also lead to imbalances, and for some social problems, you need a different approach, which would perhaps look at groups, at socioeconomic groups, rather than taking that individual line. And why I put this question is, I suppose, inspired a little bit by what Armin said. How do you tread this narrow line between giving education and avoiding indoctrination? You want to encourage the dissemination of some ideas, as Michael put it extremely convincingly. On the other hand, you don't want to fall into the trap of imposing a particular way or a particular voice in some contexts, at least. Maybe I hope it's not too vague.
Thank you very much, Alison. Armin, would you like to respond?
Well, I think I'd first give the floor to Paul, and then my questions will build on this as well.
Okay, let's go to Paul first. Paul.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much, Alison, for this great remark and a series of questions. I'm not sure if I'm now going to respond with my Reconnect hat on, or rather from my broader position as indeed a sociologist of law and of constitutionalism. One way I would like to respond is that an education that puts as a priority the critical capacities of students, of young people, that's the thing that I would want to endorse. And that means that rights are not only portrayed in my classes, for instance, as individual and social rights, but I actually try to tease out a whole bunch of tensions, dimensions. For instance, critically discussing the emergence of the human rights context in which we find ourselves today. Let's say the sort of, in Europe at least, the dual context of the European Union and the European Convention. And for instance, making very clear from the start that the European Convention always faced great resistance, difference of opinion of which rights are important, which rights should have priority, and so on and so forth. And that includes also, I think that's a good point. I just finished a chapter on this, writing on the French scholar Marcel Gaucher, who indeed criticizes human rights for their hyper-individualism, leading to some kind of legal democracy, but not allowing collective projects to emerge anymore. Well, one doesn't need to be agreeing with that type of argument, but I think it's an important argument to convey and to articulate to students to think about in context of issues like social inequality, issues of too strong links, you might say, or at least strong links between multinational corporations and national governments, and so on and so forth. And what you argue about indoctrination, I find it difficult to avoid at least a particular normative / political stance when teaching about these matters. I think one should be clear about, and maybe as a sociologist, I have a different relationship to such dimensions than a lawyer would have. I suppose most lawyers would ultimately have a sort of common ground of agreement on the relevance, the importance of human rights, etc. Sociologists, you can't find two sociologists and put them in a room together and they will agree. That's roughly impossible. It's in a way a science of disagreement, I suppose. And so for me, the importance is to teach students this, that there is no one way of understanding human rights. There is no final, let's say, sort of religion of human rights. It remains ultimately a contestable concept, but it doesn't mean at all that it is without meaning. And well, there's so many examples we can give. I'm very much myself interested in struggles in Central and Eastern Europe, and it's extremely interesting to see how the human rights dissidents of the 1970s and 80s is now in some ways re-emerging in a very different context and in very different expressions, but it remains there. And I mean, these aspects are fascinating from that perspective. So I don't think I've answered your questions in any way, but that's the way I would go about them, more or less.
Micah, would you like to come in possibly?
On the individual versus social rights?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think we've actually approached the human rights situation in the MOOC as a distinction between individual and social rights. We have asked the MOOC learners about their opinion on human rights and whether they feel like they know enough about them. And there we actually get the sense that a lot of people in Europe, or a lot of the learners from the MOOC, really had no idea on what their human rights entailed. And I don't think they could make the distinction themselves between the individual ones and the social ones. But I do agree with what, sorry, I forgot your name. Was it Alison?
Alison, yes.
I do agree with the fact that we should be careful about putting too much focus about individual rights alone, and make sure that everyone is aware of social rights and the things that we should want to have in a group or collectively. So yeah, that's something that I agree that we should focus on.
Yes. Thank you. And that's thought about the individual against social rights contest or discussion is particularly apposite now with the question of individual rights not to wear COVID masks and things like this. I was actually quite shocked yesterday when I saw, even on public transport, just from outside the buses and so on, you could see a considerable number of people in London still perfectly happily and really rather arrogantly floating around without masks, without any obvious, perhaps, reason to have an exemption.
Can I come in quickly again? Sorry.
Yes.
I just want to say something that both is not really an answer, but is still about the question from Alison, but also the intervention from Michael. Because something that we noticed in the MOOC is that people were a lot more engaged with human rights when we could link it to actual real life situations. And so we saw a rise in learners when Hungary adopted their new LGBTQ law. And I think that is something where we could really be of added value, show people how real life implications of rule of law breaches actually well, hinder all of the human rights, not only of the LGBTQ community, but also of everyone in that society. And I think that that is where education should come in.
Yes, thank you very much. Armin, would you like to take the floor, please?
Yep, thanks very much. To add on that last point, by the way, I think it's a very valuable point to use the example of the refugee crisis and migration rights. We've been talking about that for a long time. You only need one picture of a small boy on a beach to make that point much more powerfully and discuss it. If we shy away from those means of communication and those emotionally powerful messages, we might not have the impact that we need. Of course, when we do, as Alison indicated, we are on a tightrope between indoctrination and education. But maybe there I'll take a bit more position. But I think we should be less afraid. And I think the balance we can strive there is where we depend on our scientific expertise. And I think we're allowed to say, listen, at this point, based on the evidence and scientific research, I'm allowed to say that there are some things more likely to be true than others. And that we need to resist the kind of cheap version of challenging knowledge and knowledge philosophy. I mean, there's a kind of cheap version saying, well, there's no objective truth, so therefore everything is equally true. So therefore my opinion is as valuable as yours. And that is a very perverted version of more refined theories on the relativity of knowledge. And I think we need to fight that and resist it. And I think you can clearly say as an academic, this is the best version of the truth we've discovered so far. You can use your own doubts to train people to think critically, to challenge your own thoughts in class and to show it. But at the same time, never to go into the type of BBC equal time narrative saying, so these 50 billion people say this, but this one very crazy person in his attic says this, so both might be true. No. And I think we can do that without going into a US system where you have left universities and now right universities where they teach left and right truths. I think precisely to avoid that, we should resist the claim that there is no claims that are more true than others. And there we have a position as university. And I think as long as you stick within those boundaries and your academic integrity, you are educating and not indoctrinating. And that, I think, is something we need to do more, and we should be maybe more brave in doing that. That said, we also need to remain, of course, sensitive, because if you make one error here, you can be attacked quite vehemently because we have a higher burden of proof than others. It's easier for them to attack us as vested institutions, which is also fair because we claim a certain societal status and authority claim because we're universities, and you need to defend those and make those true. Maybe two more examples also in response to Paul on this issue of human rights and students. One research project I'm doing is together with social psychologists, and we're looking at the social psychology of European integration, including on legitimacy. And there we see that actually it's not so much the substance of the rights or the substantive benefits that trigger people. The most strong predictor we found so far is the threat to identity. So not having a strong national identity, but feeling threatened in that identity, which also means that I think that as lawyers, we shouldn't just talk about the substantive benefits. We should also understand the sources of threat and address those, because people are, I think, quite often convinced about the benefits they have, but they still feel threatened in other areas. So you need to do both, convey the benefits and reduce the threat. And in that context, what I also notice with my own students, and here I just have to add, this is a very much one person observing several cohorts of students, is that there's indeed a decreased reference for democracy. And there tends to be this more, well, let me call it youthful arrogance, that they belong to the young intellectual elite. They know how the world works. And increasingly, it's annoying that all these stupid people also have something to say because they don't study. And that may in part be true because they have had the benefits of democracy so long, right? It's the same as with the EU, this oxygen argument. You only appreciate it once it's gone. That's true for democracy and European integration. But I do fear that this is a bit of a trend, and that under even the intellectual elite, which should supposed to be the bulwark of democracy, there's actually increasingly cynicism. Now, that's also not new. Intellectual elites have doubted the common man for a long time. Churchill already said, right, we all know that. But I do have a feeling that it's on the rise in my students, and that it's a concern I have. So I'm gonna leave it at that.
Yes, sometimes there are inherent difficulties when we want to encourage people to think, to criticize, to develop their own capacities, to ask questions, and not to simply to accept something on the basis that the authority which is telling them that something is right. And then if they suddenly turn around and go in directions we don't like, we wonder quite where we went wrong. It's a tension which I see people here nodding and smiling. So I think it's something one can understand. Alison, do you feel we've started to address some of the issues you were thinking of?
Well, I just want to reassure Armin that when I was putting my phrase also a little bit sharply in terms of education or indoctrination, I was taking the example of individual approaches or more social approaches to rights as showing that even within, shall I call it, the good, you may have differences of opinion and therefore get into some reasonable doubts about how you can present that. But on the whole, I would agree with everything that's been said. I would only add, since Lawrence was kind enough to offer me the microphone now, that it's easier when we're talking about university level education to talk about finding a balance between having a view, a moral view also, and encouraging critical thought. What was being presented earlier on, of course, is a different kind of education. And while I'm, of course, thoroughly in favor of the content of that, I wonder how it can be presented in a way that certain political groups in Hungary, Poland, but also in the Netherlands would have no legitimate reason to be able to complain, if you see what I mean.
Yes, but of course, what we think is a legitimate reason, they will say.
Ad infinitum, Lawrence, ad infinitum.
Yes, yes, they will jump up.
Yeah, I mean, we can see the debates going on in America. Of course, America's a federal system, but education is also a federal competence here, and we know the discussions going on the other side of the Atlantic about critical race theory and attempts in some parts of some states to forbid teaching critical race theory. It just is another example of how delicate this topic can be. I mean, in the Netherlands, we have freedom of education. So while I can see that offering information is one thing, I think we do have to be very, very careful whether, if we're getting into a situation where this is being imposed in some way, or it at least is being promoted.
Yes, well, of course, you'll remember that institutions in America, such as Harvard and so on, originally started out as publicly funded universities. And the reason why they went private is because the academics were fed up of the politicians telling them what they had to teach and how they had to teach it. That may be a path which, well, it doesn't always have happy endings, but it may be path which people made to look at and wonder about. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just looking at timings. I'm looking also at Oliver and Margot, who are the persons who should be obeyed. I'm just wondering, is there anything else on the topics which you'd like to talk about, or if you think we haven't covered adequately? Then we have a little time in which to do it. I mean, we're due to finish at 12:30, but obviously if people feel that they've exhausted what they want to say on this topic, then we can finish earlier.
Can I ask a quick question to Daniela about the info sheets?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, please.
So an issue that also kind of addresses what Alison just said. So in the Reconnect MOOC, we have dealt with some Hungarian trolls commenting on the content of the MOOC and intervening in the discussion assignments and, of course, saying things that are not educational for anyone. Are you also with the info sheets trying to support teachers when, for example, students in their classes of, I imagine, high school age are very critical towards, for example, human rights? Are you also going to provide support for teachers on how to, well, address these kind of issues when people really are not on the same page as us, as academics?
It's a good question. I mean, the guidance notes are quite sort of explanatory. I mean, there's a lot of information there. There is additional resources for the teachers that they can refer to if they need to explain concepts in more detail. There's videos as well which accompany the different info sheets. So again, maybe if the text isn't enough or isn't convincing enough, then people can also look at the videos and use those as resources. And hopefully that might convince some students to change their opinions. But yeah, it's definitely a good question. I think maybe to think of additional ways in which we could support teachers with students who are maybe not easily convinced. But you know, we try to address some of that in the guidance notes. So to provide as many additional resources as possible in case there are more questions, in case students want to have more information, and so to share that as widely as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, it's a really hard position to be in, because for me in the MOOC, I sometimes wonder, should I remove the nasty comments from the discussion fora, or should I leave them in there so that the discussion is open and fair to everyone? It's really hard to balance those different types of truths that we already spoke about. So I was just curious, but thank you for your answer.
I think that becomes a moderation issue, doesn't it? I mean, if comments are obviously abusive and offensive to groups, then they should be removed and the people can be excluded from the discussions. But of course, you know, there should be.
Yeah, that's more difficult to achieve in a set classroom, I think. That's
true. Yes, Oliver. Do you want to come sit here, Oliver? And you can with the microphone, and people can see you. Oliver, ladies and gentlemen, Oliver Garner from the British Institute.
Quite an introduction. Oh, thank you very much to all the panelists for really informative presentations. And I think I have two questions. The first question is to Daniela on the materials and about whether there are any plans to expand this also to young people in the candidate states. So this might be going forward to our final panel this afternoon, because I could see them as being incredibly valuable tools really for that preparation to become EU citizens. And then the second question is maybe addressing something that Paul said about trying to almost socially embed this narrative to appeal to young people. And it's something I was pleasantly surprised to see in the educational materials, that football images were used to illustrate the rule of law. And it made me think about whether things like football or music, those things that young people are really inherently engaged with, could be used as a tool here. And I was thinking about how there was a big reaction against the proposed European Super League last year. There were protests outside Stamford Bridge in Chelsea, and that was actually kind of almost a transnational grassroots uprising against what can be seen as a exercise of illegitimate power for a social institution. So I was wondering if phenomena like that could be used then and kind of extrapolated and pushed forward to the political arena as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Yeah, I think it's very, we should definitely think about the candidate states. I think these materials are designed for all European states, so not just EU member states, and we have on our list of educational organizations also countries that are outside of the EU. But I think it's good that you mentioned that, because we could maybe emphasize it even more than we already, and maybe find additional organizations to the ones we already have on the list. So because yes, I agree that especially if we're looking at topics like what are my rights as an EU citizen, I think it's really useful for people who want to become members of the EU to know, for young people, okay, what will we gain? What will my state gain by joining the EU? How do I benefit from this? So yeah, I think it's something to definitely think about. But yes, this is aimed at everybody. So young people across Europe, and then yeah, with the Super League example, I think it's a really good example. About how certain issues can be made more attractive, I think, to young people, and how it also reflects what they might be interested in their personal lives. So yeah, I think the football example is good. So maybe we'll think about that more. Yeah. Oh, this one.
What's actually observing the discussion?
That's it wasn't. Yeah, no, I never touch anything. You know, is that if you wonder what the connection was, sort of conference-wise, between London-Leiden and you know, the education side of this. Funnily enough, we tried this, and Lawrence might remember, and so does Jacqueline Miner, about maybe 6 years ago, when we talked about the educational side. And I think Michael might remember that as well. It might be just before your time, so to say. Yeah. And we had, I think, a sort of discussion on patterns in the morning, and then the educational discussion in the afternoon. And funnily enough, we had Jacqueline as one of the main speakers, and everybody disappeared. And this has totally changed. And, you know, London-Leiden has been in need for quite a long time to attract a younger audience as well, as you can see, you know, from the stalwarts, and I think Neville March-Hunnings won't object to being included in that group as well.
Described as a younger member.
Well, Neville was three months earlier than me in Luxembourg, because this was well before the UK even had a twinkling in its eye of joining. So no Brit, but he was there, and then I found out later that I was there 3 months after that, because I wasn't a Brit at that time. But the connection has sort of it's proved itself today, actually. The interest, there is a time and a place for everything, and I think today has done a lot for sort of the continuation of the 60 years of London-Leiden. Well, Alison will undoubtedly agree with us, and many others as well. I mean, I've found this quite illuminating. Thanks.
So have I, if I can say so from the chair, because I was completely unaware of what Reconnect was doing on this. And although I'm no longer on the Alpha board, I still have a certain degree of influence there. And I'm going to suggest that either this meeting, currently next April in Warsaw, or at the following AGM, that the Reconnect scholars be invited to give a presentation and a slot to discuss this, because I think what is being done here is of considerable value and deserves a wider platform than it's getting among educators elsewhere. Just to go back to one last thing with Neville, of course, Neville will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think along with you were Donald Valentine, and I think, was it Dennis Thompson at Neville, with the Common Market Law reports. And of course, Donald Valentine is someone with whom I have a personal connection, because he taught me at LSE my first ever exposure to European law before being exposed to English law. So I got in at the best part of law first. With that, I think, subject to anyone else wanting to intervene, it remains for me to say that the morning of the 60th anniversary of the London-Leiden meeting has been extremely fruitful. I think we've all enjoyed it. The audience has perhaps been smaller than we would have hoped, but I think it's been very much worthwhile. And I certainly have learned a lot about what people are doing. I'm very grateful to everyone for giving me that opportunity. Legal education has just come a hell of a long way since what even happened, at least with one person whose name I won't mention, in the days when I was reading for the old bar part 1, was that somebody simply sat and read their book out. And in French universities, or certain French universities in certain areas, that still happens. So I think we've got a long way to go, but at least we are on the path and getting there. So thank you very much. We will see each other in an hour's time, just over an hour's time, at 2:30 UK time, 3:30 continental time. And the subject for the discussion then will be the third panel under chairmanship of Oliver, young people in the backsliding and candidate member states. And with that, I wish everyone a good lunch. Thank you very much. And thank you to the speakers, of course, who've been absolutely wonderful. Thunderous applause will now follow.